In Section 2 of Reproductive Physiology, we will discuss puberty. We'll begin with looking at Figure 10.2 on page 446, in which we see that the reproductive hormones are same in both males and females, except when we reach adult reproductive period and senescence. In both male and females, the gonadal function is driven by the hypothalamic-pituitary axis, whose activity varies over the lifespan. Secretion of the gonadotropin-releasing hormones, GnRH, the hypothalamic hormone, begins at gestational week 4, but its levels remain low until puberty. Secretion of follicle-stimulating hormone, FSH, and luteinizing hormone, which are anterior pituitary hormones, begins at gestational weeks 10 and 12. Like GnRH, the levels of FSH and LH remain low until puberty. During childhood, FSH levels are relatively higher than LH levels. However, at puberty and throughout the reproductive years, this secretory pattern changes. Secretion of GnRH, FSH, and LH increases and becomes pulsatile. The relative levels of FSH and LH reverse, with LH becoming higher than FSH levels. In addition, in females, there is a 28-day cycle of gonadotropin secretion, which we know as the menstrual cycle. Finally, in senescence, gonadotropin secretion rates increase further, with FSH levels becoming higher than LH levels as they were in childhood. Now, the primary event at puberty is the initiation of pulsatile secretion of GnRH. This new pattern of secretion drives a parallel pulsatile secretion of FSH and LH by the anterior lobe of the pituitary. And one of the earliest events of puberty is the appearance of the large nocturnal pulses of luteinizing hormone. Another significant event early in puberty is an increased sensitivity of the GnRH receptor in the anterior pituitary. Thus, at puberty, GnRH is responsible for upregulating its own receptor in the anterior pituitary, and a given concentration of GnRH produces a greater stimulation of FSH and LH secretion. Thus, we are becoming more sensitized to the effects of GnRH. In addition, there is a shift in the relative secretion rates of the two anterior pituitary hormones. And at puberty and throughout the reproductive years, LH levels are greater than FSH levels when compared with childhood and senescence, when the opposite is true and FSH is greater than LH. Pulsatile secretion of FSH and LH in turn stimulates the secretion of gonadal steroid hormones, testosterone and estradiol. And increased circulating levels of these sex steroid hormones are then responsible for the appearance of the secondary sex characteristics at puberty. Now, the onset of maturational process at puberty is genetically programmed, and familial patterns are evident. For example, the age of menarche is similar between mothers and daughters. The mechanisms underlying the onset of pulsatile GnRH secretion, however, remain a mystery, and there may be gradual maturation of the hypothalamic neurons that synthesize and secrete GnRH, which may explain the onset of this pulsatile behavior. In contrast, the central nervous system and nutritional status may alter the process. For example, people who are under extreme stress or caloric deprivation may have delayed onset of puberty. It has also been suggested that melatonin plays a role in the onset of puberty. Melatonin, of course, is secreted by the pineal gland, and it may be a natural inhibitor of GnRH release. These levels of melatonin are highest during childhood and decline during adulthood, and this decline may trigger the release of inhibition of GnRH secretion. Further support for the role of melatonin in the onset of puberty is the observation that people who have their pineal gland removed have early onset puberty. Now when we're discussing Now, when we're discussing characteristics of puberty, we should know that the biologic events of puberty are set in motion by the onset of the pulsatile activity in the hypothalamic-anterior pituitary axis. In turn, this pulsatile or bursting activity causes the testes and ovaries to secrete their respective sex hormones, namely testosterone and estrogen. And pulsatility of the hypothalamic-pituitary axis is absolutely required for normal reproductive function, as illustrated by the treatment of persons with delayed puberty caused by GnRH deficiency. If a GnRH analog is administered in intermittent pulses to replicate the normal pulsatile secretory pattern, puberty is initiated and reproductive function is established. However, if a long-acting GnRH analog is administered, puberty does not begin. Interestingly, this is the mechanism by which chemical castration is also affected, noticeably in sex addicts and sexual deviants. They're given a long-acting GnRH analog, and their sexual drive is then suppressed by the same suppression of the pulsatile activity of the hypothalamic-anterior pituitary cycle. These events of puberty and their timing are illustrated in Figure 10.3 on page 447. We see that the pulsatile activity, which begins in males around age 12, is also correlated to the developments of pubic hair, penile growth, and the growth spurt of height. In females, this pulsatile activity begins a little earlier and is correlated to earlier sexual differentiation in these females, namely growth of the breast, growth of pubic hair, menarche, and the growth spurt. Puberty is associated with activation of the hypothalamic-pituitary axis in both genders. However, in boys, it is associated with Leydig cell proliferation in the testes and increased synthesis and secretion of testosterone by the Leydig cells. There is growth of the testes, largely because of an increased number of seminiferous tubules. The growth of the sex accessory organs, such as a prostate, is pronounced, and the linear growth spurt and the epiphyses close when adult height is attained. As plasma levels of testosterone increase, the pubic and axillary hair also appears, and there's growth of the penis, lowering of the voice, initiation of spermatogenesis. Likewise, in girls, puberty is similarly associated with the activation of the hypothalamic-pituitary axis. However, in girls, this drives the synthesis of estradiol by the ovaries. Now, the first observable sign of puberty in women is budding of the breast, which is then followed approximately 2 years by menarche, the onset of the menstrual cycle. The growth spurt and closure of the epiphyses typically begin and end earlier in girls than in boys, and the appearance of pubic and axillary hair precedes menarche and is dependent on increased secretion of adrenal androgens, called adrenarche. This concludes Section 2, Puberty. This concludes Section 2, Puberty.